Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back, as is Marjani Rawls. We're talking all about the novel It today. There is a lot to discuss here, but Marjani, why don't we go ahead and start with how we ended up reading this book? This was my first time reading through it, but if I'm not mistaken, you had already read it before.
I did read it before, after the new incarnation of It Part 1 came out last year. I kind of, for the podcast, like reread it again because I just wanted to kind of like refresh and to see what they didn't do and kind of what got cut out. And yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those novels where it really sticks with you when you read it the first time, but at the same time, there's so much that happens in it that I feel like a few weeks from now, even, it'll be hard to remember the exact details of the book. And I think, it took me about 2 weeks to read through this, which isn't too terrible, but at the same time, for me, that felt like forever, just given how I typically get through a book in a handful of days usually, but since it was over 1,000 pages long, it honestly might have been the longest book I've read so far. And you and I covered the Bachman books, which combined those four novels were over 900 pages. But when I read The Stand, I didn't have the uncut edition. I had the original edition that they don't even print anymore. So it was only 800 pages versus like 1,200. So for me, this was sort of not only the longest Stephen King book that I've read, but I think the longest book in general, because I started Infinite Jest and definitely did not finish it. So I don't have too many books that are, breaking that 1,000 page count. So it was definitely quite a journey to get through this one. And I think that sort of just leads right into talking about the pacing of the book, because I don't think I would have enjoyed getting through this as much as I did if the pacing totally sucked for it. I think it took me maybe about 100 pages to get into it, but how did you feel overall about the pacing?
I think that this was a book where it being so long was kind of the right thing. Because if it was, and I know like a lot of people are kind of familiar with like the TV miniseries and like the movies and stuff like that, but I felt like just kind of getting into Derry and kind of getting into these characters slowly, and then like what it actually is, and going back and forth from present time to the past. I thought Stephen King did a good job with that. It didn't. It wasn't overwhelming, like because like you said, so much happens. So much happens in like the just the flashbacks and all like the horror that happens there. And I think that for me it was good. It was the right thing to do.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think going into reading this book for the first time and already having a rough idea of what to expect from at least the past storyline, just from seeing the TV miniseries and the first movie of the new adaptation. And with chapter 2 coming out soon, we'll definitely see a more full picture of what the book is all about. Because if I'm not mistaken, in the miniseries, it really only covered the Losers Club as children. So you didn't really get a full sense of the entirety of what we read in the novel. So it was just nice to be able to sort of, I guess, finish putting the pieces together for the story, because when the first of the new adaptation came out, I kind of knew there was more to it than that. And then when chapter 2 was announced, I was like, okay, here we go. I think this is going to be the adaptation that really gives us this well rounded story. And the book, even though it took me a little while to get into it, like you said, the jumping back and forth between the present day and then what happened back in 1957 and 1958, he made it so that it was so seamless. He would literally start a sentence in the past and finish it in the future part, and vice versa. And I think that was something that kept things very interesting. You're like, oh, okay, here's how all of these things tie together and all of these parallels are coming back to the present day and sort of just haunting them all over again.
Yeah, because really at the heart of the story, it's really about, a bunch of friends who have this trauma and they make this oath to come back and kind of fight it. I like the whole concept of him kind of making it so they most of them forget the memories and whatnot, and then having to come back and like come back for where that small town, Derry, and coming back and kind of confronting this because it's kind of like unfinished business. Like it's sometimes with life, like you kind of have to like revisit things in order to go forward. So
Exactly. Let's go ahead and dive into the characters because not only is there the Losers Club and Pennywise, but you sort of have these ancillary characters who pop up pretty frequently as well. But to start with the Losers Club, you have Bill Denbrough, Ben Hanscom, Beverly Marsh, Richard Tozier, also known as Trash Mouth, because, of course, they have to have a nickname for him, Eddie Kasprak, Mike Hanlon, and Stan Uris make up that core group of the Losers Club, and it all comes about after Bill's brother Georgie is killed by Pennywise, and there's a rash of child murders going on, and no one is able to figure it out. So you have the cops who are involved as well, and they don't really play a super crucial role in the bigger picture of things, but you have to have them in there so that you can really get a sense for how desperate the town is to try and figure this out. And I think just the core group of the Losers Club, they are obviously the most interesting of the characters because they're so young when this happens still. And then, like you said, they forget as they leave the town, and Mike is the only one who stays behind. So he is sort of the one who is stuck with all of these memories on a regular basis while the rest of them have moved on with their lives and most of them have, made something of themselves. So to have just the juxtaposition of the past when this big event happened and the present day when it's all coming back and happening again, just to see how those characters sort of fall back into their old ways, I guess. It was really nice to see that sort of character development in the past so that when you get to the present day, it's like, of course, they would sort of just pick up where they left off. I'm sure a lot of people have friends who are like that. You could go years without seeing them, but when you do see them, it's like nothing has really changed.
yeah, it's like when I think Mike calls Bill and it's been years since he stuttered, and then he starts remembering, he starts stuttering again. Like their ailments that they kind of forgot, like
Right.
started coming back. Like Eddie was, like he had the relationship with his mother that like with the whole like he's sick for everything, and then he finds out that he's not really sick, and then that he goes, to be like an adult, and then that comes like I when I read the book, and of course like we touched on all the forms of media and stuff like that. I felt even more in tune to these characters because they're even more fleshed out in the book.
Yeah.
Like you said, yeah, like you said in the miniseries, like they go more towards the 1958 Derry and whatnot. But I guess there's more to the story here, and you really see like the friendship and bond that they have. And I'm pretty sure we'll talk about like a specific thing later. But yeah, that's what I've really felt that. I really, you know what I mean? Like it was just it was weird because like when I first read it and I was super super like young then,
Mm-hmm.
not to say I'm old now. Like I cuz so you're like, "Oh, it's this clown and it's terrorizing," but like it is a entity like,
Yeah.
and like despite them moving away and whatnot, like it's always going to be around and it was always going to terrorize people. So I found it great that Stephen King brought them back when they were older to finish what they started, because like what you said, um, you have friends who you cannot talk to for like years, but when you start talking and you start reminiscing, you kind of pick it right back up. And that's how it is. Like they're like, oh wow, now I start remembering, oh, we did have this bond. oh, we do have to go back to Derry and kill this thing somehow.
Even when they all start getting the calls for Mike, as soon as they realize it's Mike, you can sense that things are starting to come back to them and they know that they made this promise, even if they don't necessarily remember why they made the promise, just the fact that they're all able to have it click in their heads. Okay, we made this promise. And unfortunately, Stan is the one who doesn't make it back. You know,
Yep.
he ends up dying before he can do that. And, you know, it's of his own doing. So it seems anyway. And he was just so engrossed in everything in 1958, and it definitely had an impact on him, and obviously it had an impact on everyone else. But you know, with Stan, once he got that call, he was like, no, I cannot do this again. And you can't really blame him given what happened in 1957 and 1958. And just to see that group come back, even though they're a man short, and keep this bond going, even though we know that it's going to go away again. It's just really amazing how well Stephen King wrote that into the book. And one of the other things I want to note before we dive into Pennywise a little more is the spouses of some of the characters and how involved they were in the story. I think it surprised me how much time we spent with both Tom, who is Beverly's husband, and Audra, who is Bill's wife. And she happens to look a lot like Beverly, apparently, which,
Yeah.
you know, he doesn't really realize until he sees Beverly again. And then Audra ends up following him to Derry, and Tom follows Beverly to Derry for a very different reason. You know, Audra is just genuinely curious about what would make her husband go back to this, you know, small town that has, you know, not a lot going for it. It has sort of become a bigger town, so to speak, by the time the 80s roll around because of all the banks that have moved in and, you know, whatnot. But then this happens again, and it sort of just goes back to that same town it was in the 50s. So, in a way, the town is a bit of a character, too.
Yeah. Beverly's character was very interesting to me because all the boys seem like they have their fear rooted in kind of like movie villains and stuff like that. You saw with like
Yeah.
like the werewolf and whatnot. Beverly had an abusive father, so you know Al Marsh and whatnot. Like, so she had real trauma. So it seemed like she. I don't know if did you think that she was like the de facto kind of leader of the group or one of the leaders of the group? Because it seemed like she was, to me, it seemed, you know, with everything that's going on and whatnot, like she kind of like seemed like she was one of the most mature, I guess.
Right. I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that she was the only girl in the group. You know, it was clear that for the guys, Bill was their leader,
Yeah,
and they did accept Beverly to a point where they knew she was capable of, you know, holding her own within the group, and that she was probably, you know, number two as far as leadership goes, because they all sort of look to Bill as the one with the ideas and everything like that. But I think at the same time, Beverly was able to just kind of get everyone in line when it was necessary, and they would actually listen to her. So she definitely had some power over the group, and I don't mean that in a negative way or anything, but
yeah,
they respected her enough to listen to her. It's not like, oh, you're just the girl in the group, what do you know? And maybe they felt like that initially, but it quickly went away because they were like, oh, you know, she's not like all of the other girls that they would see at school or whatever.
yeah. And it's funny, like you mentioned, like Bill and Beverly, and they get married and whatnot. Like when Bill kind of, it's funny because you mentioned that you know Audra looks a lot like Beverly, but Bill
Hmm.
doesn't initially have like the memories of him having a crush on Beverly when he's older,
Yeah.
which I thought was like, which I thought was funny and whatnot. so that whole thing of memory comes into play with the town and whatnot, and like kind of like bringing back these repressed memories
Hmm.
and whatnot. Like when Mike, I think he sends out everybody to kind of like regain their memories and whatnot, and
Yeah, he has them go to like a specific place where they first saw it.
yeah,
And it really starts to jog their memories. And you can tell that their time away from this town, especially the ones who were further away, like Bill, he had gone overseas, and you could really tell that it did a number on their memory to be away for so long. But for Mike, because he was the one who stayed behind, he really knew what needed to be done. So it's almost like when they all regrouped back in Derry, Mike was briefly that leader that they needed because he had stayed.
yeah, I like that Mike was kind of like the bridge, or I wouldn't say like the travel host or anything like that, but like I like that he at least somebody stayed in Derry because I feel like if nobody did and everybody left, uh,
There'd be no
there would
story.
be, yeah, there'd be no story, there'd be no bridge. So like Mike staying and kind of like getting everybody to remember things, and then them going into the photo book and whatnot, and seeing like Derry's history, and then kind of revisiting it again was pretty good.
Yeah, we have some other characters who play a big role, especially in the 1958 part of the story, and that is Henry Bowers and his little gang of troublemakers. Basically, they're the bullies in town, and they cannot stand the losers club. They're always trying to make life difficult for them. And Henry actually comes back in the present day storyline, and he is just still being possessed to ruin these people's lives and kill them, which clearly didn't work back in 1958. So not a huge surprise that it didn't entirely work in the 80s either, because it was one of those things where he had an attempt on Mike's life and it didn't ultimately result in Mike's death, which they had you thinking it would for a while, and it almost did a second time when someone else tried to kill him. And, Mike is just having a rough time. He stayed behind in Derry and he's really paid the price for it at the same time.
Yeah, well, I mean, didn't he like it possessed him and he killed his father, and then he confessed to killing for somehow because I mean we know when he's not responsible for this, but he confessed to killing all the other kids somehow, and then he was in the asylum since 1958. So I mean, I don't really. He's a bully. He's a jerk in his book, just like he is in all the other mediums. And I don't know if I really feel bad for him because he is being possessed.
It's hard to feel bad even though he's possessed because he was a jerk before he was possessed. It's not like he was some good kid at school or just in the town in general and wasn't getting into trouble. He was causing plenty of trouble before he was possessed. And, maybe his home life wasn't that great either. But, like you mentioned, Beverly had an abusive father and she didn't go around being possessed by it and terrorizing everyone. So you have these different reactions basically to how someone grew up. Beverly does end up marrying someone who is just like her father, which is very unfortunate. And I don't know if that's something they'll necessarily keep in It Chapter 2 when that comes out. I didn't notice a wedding ring on her hand anyway, so we'll see on that. But it was something that really just let you dive into Beverly's character a little more psychologically. It's like even before she gets back to Derry, you're like, okay, you got to get away from him. You just got to do it. Got to pull the trigger on that one. And when she finally does, you're kind of relieved. But then he goes and finds the friend who helped her and beats the crap out of her and then finds out where Beverly has gone. So you're just like, oh boy, can this guy just go away? And you really get a sense for what everyone's life is like in the present day before you dive into the thick of the story, really. And these characters all have their flaws still,
Hmm.
But most of them, except for Mike, were able to find success. You have a writer. Beverly was into fashion and designing things. You have an architect, and
A
these
DJ.
people, yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, one of them then is like a limo driver too, and he makes pretty good money driving
Yeah.
famous people around. So you have these characters who have done well for themselves despite their circumstances. And then, Mike tells them all, he's like, I made 11 grand last year. Can any of you say that? You've all flourished because you left. Meanwhile, I've stayed here and paid the price for it. And it's one of those things where, Mike was the outsider of the outsiders because of his race, because of where he lived. And it was definitely a product of the time for his character. I felt like him being the outsider of the outsiders was like, okay, that's a bit much, but given that it's the 80s, you kind of figure that's going to factor in just having a character of a different race who really stands out because from what I can tell, Derry seems to be a town where it's mostly a bunch of white people living there. So his family is sort of living on the outside of town, even. And even though they've been there, the family has been there for a long time, they've never felt like part of the town in the same way.
I feel that with Mike's character and whatnot, I think what was interesting to me and him staying there, it was like he had to do this in order for him to move on. Like he may not make the most money. He's a librarian, he's a historian or whatnot, but especially with Derry's history back, I think in the 1920s where they had the fire, this was kind of his redemption arc to kind of for himself to get everybody back and for his own success somehow. Because I mean, like you've already named everybody's occupations now where they're kind of successful and they're able to forget what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And he's still in the thick of it. Like he's still, kids are still dying and he's still in Derry. So in order getting them back and them killing it, it kind of ultimately sets him free as well. And I think that that narrative was pretty interesting to me that, you know, his character was so tied to the fate of it and, him staying there or whatnot, like it needed to happen. Like we said earlier, like if Mike doesn't stay there and Mike doesn't know all this history, you really have either them wandering around aimlessly or you have no story. But that kind of narrative was definitely interesting to me, and how like Stephen King kind of like played the race aspect and whatnot and kind of like gave it strength because Mike is, he's our narrator, he's the hero.
Right. Before we dive into discussing the story more, though, obviously we have to talk about Pennywise because the whole story of it revolves around this character. And, you know, Pennywise obviously is not human. It is not human. And the character has just been harassing the town for years upon years and keeps coming back in different iterations, basically. So when we see Pennywise the dancing clown, you think at first, okay, there's this creepy dude just hanging out in the sewers, but that's in fact not even remotely the case. Once you dig deeper into the story, you're like, okay, there is something a little more magical, but not in a good way with this character. And it's just one of those things where Stephen King wrote such a great villain for this story. And he wrote Pennywise in a way to where the kids thought they had killed him the first time around, and, or at least, got rid of him. But then Mike sticks around and sort of keeps digging. And when it starts happening again, then it's like, okay, we need to settle this once and for all. And it's just amazing how, when I was reading this, I never really expected Pennywise to do the things that he had done in the present day storyline, because obviously, having seen the adaptations, you kind of know what happens in the 1958 storyline. So just getting that additional look at Pennywise, it was like, okay, yeah, I think this might be one of the creepiest villains Stephen King has written.
Well, yeah, because it's an entity, and there's like this whole history. It's like this shape shifting creature called Glamour, and then there's like it's a thing called the Turtle, which is the like kind of like its enemy, and like he has history where it goes on like 30-year cycles, and it even goes back to like written down here like Roanoke, where it started killing people, whatnot. Like so, it is kind of like this omnipresent thing where it'll just keeps up and manifesting into anything that kind of basically you think of. It feeds on fear, and it's great because you have kids, and what do they and like what do you do like when you're a kid and you watch a scary movie and whatnot? Like obviously you're going to be more prone to be scared of it. So it feeding on kids was kind of was the right play because it'll I guess for a villain it'll always have a steady stream of life force because kids are inherently more imaginative, so they're going to be afraid of more things. So when it's funny because like when they come back and whatnot, uh, and them going as adults, uh, it's interesting for them to fight it because all the repressed memories and it shows that they really until you deal with them, they never really go away. So I like that aspect too. That like it is because we don't really know, like we know kind of what it is, but we don't because Stephen King only gives you kind of like some hints here and there. It goes along with what they've repressed. Like it's until they deal with it, it's never gonna away. It's gonna keep on feeding.
Right. And obviously, we have touched on the story because it's hard not to talk about the characters without talking about their circumstances and things that factor into the story. But the crux of the story is that Pennywise is out there killing children and he comes back every 27 years or so, I believe. And you have this thing that starts happening in 1957. It happens to Bill's brother Georgie, and he's brutally murdered along with other children. And in 1958, the core group that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, they form the Losers Club. And they're all outsiders in their own way. You can tell that a lot of other properties have sort of taken the idea of the Losers Club and put that forth in other stories. You know, the biggest one lately is Stranger Things. You can definitely see the Stephen King influences in that show, even if the monsters are different and they have some different circumstances surrounding everything that's going on in the town. But at the same time, you have this story that just really resonates because there are plenty of kids out there, one who probably shouldn't be reading this book, but probably will anyway. And, you know, there are kids who can relate to these characters. And then when you hit the present day storyline, there are plenty of adults who probably can then relate, regardless of whether or not they related to them back in their 1958 incarnation or just them as adults and sort of being reunited with their hometown and everything that's going on. So when they get that call from Mike, they're reluctant to go, but know that they need to go because, like we've mentioned, their memory starts coming back in small bits as soon as Mike calls them. And it's just one of those things where it's such a powerful story of the friendship that these people created when they were kids and how that one promise will make them drop everything and come back.
Well, yeah, I mean, I felt really bad for Bill because him losing Georgie, his parents kind of like fell into grief and kind of neglected him. And then, with Mike and whatnot, with him being ostracized because he was black, the Losers Club was really a haven for all these kids who were kind of misfits.
Yeah,
And you know what I mean? Like when you have jerks like fucking Henry, Victor, and Belch. I can't believe his name
right.
is Belch. It's tough. Like you said, like it's been in media, like Stranger Things, like the Goonies, like these kids coming together and forging a friendship, and they have this one common enemy. It and I feel with Derry's violence, it has a history of violence too. There was the Black Spot Fire. Um, there was a massacre of a mobster on the main street, and then I think there was like an ironworks explosion that killed like 100 people. So you know, this town has been hit over and over and over again by tragedy, which I don't know. When I read that and like I saw like so much stuff happen, it was kind of like a little bit like the Matrix to me, where like something would happen, a catastrophic thing would happen, and then it would just like wipe history, and then life would go on for about 28 years, and then another catastrophe would happen. Like it just kind of like every time it wakes up, it just kills people and whatnot. And yeah, this friendship was so strong that even in their adult years, it came back and got the job done, which, you know, maybe they were always destined to do.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier that there is one part of the story that we'd be talking about
Oh,
specifically that, everyone had really forgotten about. And then when Beverly remembers it, she sort of freaks out, but not as long as you would expect. She freaks out, gets her little freak out of the way, and then she's aware enough of the circumstances to know that, okay, this is something I can't fixate on right now, but it just came back to me. And you warned me that this part was coming in like the second half of the book. So, I hit the second half of the book and I was like, in the back of my mind, okay, when is this going to happen? When is this going to happen? And it literally happens at like the very, very end of the book. So
hmm
you have these kids all doing their part, and they're what, like 12 or so in
yeah. I want
1958?
I want to say 12 and 13.
Yeah. So Stephen King wrote in this orgy between all of the boys and Beverly. And it's one of the most bizarre things I think I've read in a Stephen King book so far, simply because of what they were already going through. And it felt so out of character for Beverly to think that's how she would save them. And it was my one issue, I would say, with the book, really, aside from, quite a bit of the language being used that doesn't age well today. There are some uncomfortable moments in this book, but I think that by far was the most uncomfortable. So then when the book ended, like, 10, 20 pages later, I was like, okay, well, I didn't have to sit with that for too long, before hitting the end of the story there. But it is something that connects them all in a way that none of them seem to really remember until they come closer and closer to defeating it. And then it's like, oh, yeah, we did that.
Well, the ritual of Chud, or I want to say Chud. I know how
Chud,
Chud.
I think, yeah.
Well, here's the thing. It will be in the movie, and it's basically what it is basically when the Losers Club extends their tongues, overlaps them, bites down, and tells jokes until somebody laughs. It's basically like a battle of wits, and I don't think that it will be quite like we're talking about what happened in the book. But yeah, this was. Basically reading towards the end and then coming across this, you're like, whoa. We've talked a lot about Stephen King books in the past before, especially I guess with the Bachman books and like school shootings and whatnot. And you're like, wow, well, why did he write that? And this was
Right.
another thing in that whole category of like what the like I understand. No, I don't understand why. Like I
I don't think anyone could reasonably understand why he would have written this other than him. And it's one of those things where you just feel so weird reading it. And thankfully, it only lasts like maybe 2 or 3 pages.
pages.
And out of a book that's over 1,000 pages, that's very, very small in the grand scheme of things. But as far as how it impacts all of them, that's a very big thing. And especially for Beverly. And, once she remembers it, she kind of, to me at least, it felt like she had this thought of why on earth would I have done that?
Yeah. Apparently, I mean, I don't know, like all of them did that, and then I guess two of them. I guess there was. It feels weird talking about it, but
We don't have to spend too much time on
yeah, no,
it.
yeah, but like it's like you know, I'm trying to figure out. I'm trying to say figure out the way to say this, but like only two of them really, I guess, loved her. I'm like, it's like, um, I don't know. Like, I just think that there is another way to incorporate a bond between friends other than, having the only female friend basically have sex with all the males. You know what I mean? Like, especially being young, like, it was just like, okay, this is the only way to do it. Like, what? Like, they have exchanged. They made like a blood pact. I'm like
Yeah,
that's something that I
that's good
mean,
enough.
yeah, that's good enough. Whether again, really risque to do that, but way better than I guess what. And I think Stephen King has come out and said that he's regretted writing that. But yeah, that was. I'm like, wow, end of the book, home stretch. Whoa, what the hell?
Yeah, I don't doubt that in a way all of the boys loved her, but for most of them it was as a friend
Yeah,
in the way that you love your group of best friends when you're 12 years old, but really it was Bill and Ben who had this infatuation with Beverly. So then to play it off as, oh hey, they all really had this sort of infatuation with her. It's like, but they didn't. You can clearly get that throughout the rest of the story. And, I think that's where we'll leave off that part of the conversation there. I just wanted to sort of get that out of the way as far as, the things that bonded these characters together for life, because, like I said, that's a big deal, but super weird. So we will move on to other parts of the story now. And obviously, even though that comes at the tail end, it's not the complete end of the book. You have to really get to how these characters feel after they've defeated Pennywise. And, the town is literally crumbling because of what they've had to do. And they have to leave one of the guys down there in, these deep, dark depths of these sewer pipes and whatnot, basically. And you just feel so bad for everything that these characters have gone through by the end of it. And the whole town is wondering what on earth is happening. To them, it's like another flood, basically. And you have stores that are literally falling into where, all of the characters are trying to defeat Pennywise. And it just makes it even more of a struggle for them to get everyone out. And Audra's down there in the middle of everything. And so Bill is still trying to save her, even though he clearly has feelings for Beverly. I don't doubt that he also had feelings for his wife still. I don't think that going back to Derry would have changed that fact necessarily. And we see that Bill stays with Audra literally until the end. They go stay at Mike's house and they try to just wait out her recovery before leaving the town, and Mike's recovery as well, because he's in the hospital. He's not going home really right away.
yeah.
So you have all of these things that are happening, and they manage to save Mike's life during the ritual. And it's just one of those powerful moments where you're like, they are sacrificing everything just to make sure that this town makes it out of this alive, basically, even though it's totally trashed by the end of it.
Not Eddie though. Eddie does not make it out.
Right. He's the one they had to leave behind. And, that's what I mean by they're willing to sacrifice everything. Eddie knows that this has to happen. And even if not all of them make it out alive, they can't give up because there's something bigger worth saving.
Yeah, and while he, I think it starts bargaining with Bill and Richie because it knows it's about to die. So it's like, hey, I'll restore Aldra's mind. I'll give you long lives and whatnot. And they ended up killing it anyway. But then there's this
Right.
lingering thing where um, Ben, who thinks that he smashed all the eggs, but then there's like this lingering feeling, like in a horror movie where like they're hinting at a sequel,
Yeah.
uh, that maybe he didn't kill all the eggs and maybe this will happen again. Um, so I feel that, I don't know. I don't know if that was intentional for that, Stephen King
Who knows? I mean, look how long of a gap there was between him writing The Shining
Shining,
and Doctor
Doctor
Sleep.
Sleep. Yeah, like I was thinking because this is such an internal entity and whatnot, like maybe it can come back again, but maybe it will, how like sequels are, like maybe it'll be new kids uh this time around because I really feel like the Losers Club story at this conclusion with everything they lost and everything that they went through really came together and was at an end once they basically beat the hell out of it. Like they physically beat it,
Yeah.
so, which I mean it deserves. But yeah, I I liked how it ended. You know, it's
It's a lot to take in. That's for sure.
yeah, well, I'm trying to like figure out a way how to like verbalize it because while it was so evil, it was so essential to Derry, and it kind of like propped up. I don't know if it propped up all the characters in Derry and whatnot like that, but as it started dying and getting destroyed, so did the city. So it
Yeah.
was like, wow, like I didn't know how tied this evil ass entity was to basically this small town doing,
Thriving, basically.
doing its thing. And yeah, so I'm like, oh well, like you obviously can't have it like be survive and be around, but like maybe that was kind of like their quest anyway. Like maybe Derry had to die because if it was still around, it would still have a feeding ground.
Yeah. What do you think of the fact that they're all going to forget again? Because you have that moment at the end where you're spending this time with Mike after he's recovered and he keeps having to write over things because they keep disappearing from the page. So clearly there's still this fantasy and magic that's happening in Derry because, ink doesn't just disappear from paper as quickly as it is in the story anyway. And, in a way, even though the others left and forgot a lot more of the story than Mike did, now it really feels final because Mike is still in Derry and he's even forgetting. And these words are vanishing from his journals that he kept throughout the whole process because he was like, I need to write this down, because no one else is going to do it. And even though Bill is the writer, which I thought was a little ironic, but
Yeah,
that's something that just shows you how dedicated Mike was to finishing this thing.
I think that it was symbolic in that Mike needed to move on and forget. He'd stayed there long enough. He had brought everybody back together. And for him to try and to recall all these memories of what happened, like the magic, it was giving him like an out. Like, okay, like you did good. You know what I mean? Like you defeated this. Derry is kind of in this new state of being now that it's gone. Now it has to pick up the pieces without this entity kind of hanging over and whatnot. All right, now Mike has to figure out his own way and his own basically story, just like everybody else did. Like Beverly gets somebody who's not abusive. Ben is happy. He's no longer lonely. You know what I mean? Like, so it was time for, I guess the magic was in basically erasing the story so that, now Derry and Mike can have something not tied to this damn evil thing.
Some semblance of a normal life for all of them, basically, even
Yeah.
though most of them had gone on and had success. And, there's nothing wrong with Mike being a librarian. It was just, he was in this small town and there was no way that was going to be a job that paid super well in comparison to all of the other careers that everyone else had. And, Stan and Eddie ultimately pay the price for what happened. So they've suffered this loss, but in due time, they won't even remember that necessarily. So, it's one of those triumphant endings, but also a very sad ending at the same time because you know what they've gone through, how much they've lost. And I do quickly want to talk about Derry a little more in general because I don't know what it is about Stephen King books and adaptations and whatnot, but it almost makes me wish I grew up in a small town, even though bad things seem to happen in all of these small towns. It just
Yeah.
seems like such a tight knit community that being in Orange County, everyone kind of just either associates that with Disneyland or LA, even though it's not really LA, but that's besides the point. And, it's one of those things where it almost seems like it would be nice to know everyone and sort of just have this connection to a town that a lot of people, especially, in the areas that you and I live in, don't really seem to have, on the coast, it's like, okay, you have these sort of big mecca cities, and you don't really get that vibe where you kind of just know people. It's like you could go into the coffee shop or whatever, and there could be someone new working there like every other month practically.
Yeah.
There's not really this sort of consistency that you get with these families who grow up and almost essentially own these small towns, and that's probably partially why Stephen King has just remained in Maine. That's sort of his thing. And, he gets to own that in a way that, writers living in LA or New York or wherever don't.
Okay. Well, the benefit of us living in bigger cities and whatnot, and reference to Stephen King, is that we're probably not going to be terrorized by these crazy ass entities. Like, you know what I mean? Like, The Shining happens in a secluded cabin with a mansion and ghosts and whatnot. Derry, Indiana is like you're terrorized by a clown, a leper, a werewolf, whatever manifests in your fears. um, I think that the benefit of basically this story and these other stories is that you have the benefit of everybody knowing everybody and it being tight knit. Because if you had it in a, say like a Los Angeles, it's so big. Like, what are you gonna do? Like have your like a character, meet up at the metro every day and like kind of like, you know what I mean? Like,
It wouldn't have the same kind of impact. And, he's created these fictional cities like Derry and Castle Rock. And you really just get a sense of how Stephen King grew up in this more rural area. And, Bangor, Maine, I have never been to Maine, so I don't know. It seems like it's one of the bigger cities in Maine, but when you're in Maine, it's like, how big is your city really? In a sense. So there's just this community feeling about a lot of these stories, and it just really encapsulates that in a way that, like you said, you wouldn't get if the story took place in Los Angeles, because within Los Angeles, there are sort of these tight knit communities, but they're still so massive in comparison.
yeah, I feel that, it is the Loser Club story, but since that, their story is tied to the overall health and the kind of like the small town exuberance of Derry, like their story is just kind of like a microcosm of what happens in Derry of, the whole like going outside and, everybody knowing your name and, like meeting up, I guess, at the same shop every week and whatnot. And they're fighting this evil, awful thing that keeps coming back, but it ultimately ties up into the whole town. So, like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't think that you can really get that in like a New York or whatnot. Like, it's not, Ghostbusters or something like that. Like,
Yeah.
where you're fighting like a big, like big ghost or whatnot. But
Plus, if you tried to ride your bike in New York the way these kids ride their bikes in Derry, you'd just get run over. So there is that.
yeah, like if to go into New York City and to find an abandoned house, like, well, one, no, and if they were trying to meet up somehow, if they're riding their bikes and stuff like that, either the subway's going to make them late, somebody's going to end up dying because they can't get to the same place at the same time, or the story is going to get delayed because of various things. So, yeah, it really, especially with the whole going back from the 50s to the 80s, you get to see how, you know, the time lapse kind of changed with Derry and, Losers Club themselves.
Absolutely. Let's dive into our ratings for this book now because we've read quite a lot of Stephen King at this point. We're hitting episode 31 here. So while I have read everything chronologically lately, it's one of those things where I've sort of started forming this list of, okay, which ones are top tier for me right now. And I would definitely put it in that top tier. I believe, despite the whole weird bit at the end, I gave it a 5 out of 5 just because there's so much great storytelling in this that I wasn't going to let a few pages of weirdness ruin, my enjoyment of the book.
Yeah, I would that's is definitely top tier for me too. Revisiting the book and whatnot, and because the miniseries it kind of touches on some stuff, and there are definitely with the movie. The movie is tries to be loyal to the book, but I understand why you can't be too loyal. It's already rated R, but it made me like seeing those again before I read the book again. It made me really appreciate the book and the fact that like even though it's so long, I didn't really want to put it down. I just wanted to keep reading it and seeing all these incarnations and how it comes back through the photo books and whatnot. Like it was all interesting for somebody who loves horror like I do. This was this is definitely one of his classic books to me. So yeah, it would definitely be top tier.
Yeah. Any final thoughts on this? I know one thing that we didn't mention just yet was the fact that there was a Dick Halloran mention in this. You brought up The Shining, so I figured we had to talk about that, and that had to do with something that had happened well in the past. So Dick Halloran has been around for a while now, and he was in the fire at the Black Spot and he saved Mike's dad. So it's a very, very minor note, but in a way it plays such a big role on just how it would have impacted Mike's father's life.
Yeah, he wasn't he like he was
He was a cook in the army.
yeah, he was a cook. He was a cook in the army and then like they had like the black spot. It was burnt down by whatever they refer to as the Ku Klux Klan. But yeah, he's one of the adults that got to see it in its like form or whatnot. So it's interesting that The Shining, that psychic ability, is able to see something like it. So it's cool to see that there's some tie-ins. I had mentioned to you that they should try to do some like Stephen King cinematic universe somehow. But I guess with all the studios, different studios having rights, and I guess I don't even know if you could really even pull that off. But this would be kind of a neat way to do that in a flashback or whatnot.
Yeah, you could just have this little moment where you see this familiar character. And, you know, we briefly discussed it. And I don't know if it's necessarily that I wouldn't want a Stephen King cinematic universe, but I think in a way there have been glimpses of them already trying to do that. You know, when you watch some of the older adaptations like we've been doing lately, you catch these moments where, you know, I think everyone who picks up a Stephen King property to work on an adaptation for, they're very aware of how meta Stephen King can get. You know, I don't think these people are necessarily Stephen King rookies and they don't know what's going on here. You know, there are things that connect. And, you know, we've seen that a lot with Castle Rock, I would say. You know, they've done a nice job of sort of creating this new story, but giving you these tidbits from Stephen King's universe. So it's something that could possibly work, but like you said, because of all the different studios doing it and TV shows being on Hulu and different channels and things like that, it would just be so massive of a project to take on, to have all of these studios communicating with each other and movies tying into TV shows, which, you know, it would be quite a feat if they did pull it off, but I don't think anyone is going to attempt that anytime soon.
I think there was a little it nod in the Dark Tower recently, just like a sign or something like that.
Okay.
But yeah, just like you said, it would be so difficult, and I don't even know if Stephen King would even want to do like I don't know because he's in these novels he's brought characters back. He's the Man in Black is in a lot of stories. So,
Right.
obviously there are some entities around, either good or evil that permeate throughout all these books and reoccur again and again. So maybe you would be on board for it.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see if something like that could be possible. It just would completely blow my mind if someone actually goes for it. And, you know, with Stephen King getting older, we can probably only expect so many more books from him. He's still cranking them out. You know, that's no surprise to anyone, I don't think. But it'll be a sad day when there's just fewer and fewer Stephen King things coming out. And obviously, with the amount of work he's done, you know, people will always be interested in stories like it. And typically, I don't necessarily think that reboots need to happen or anything like that. But in the case of it, with the first one being a TV miniseries in 1990, I think now was a good time to, you know, give us the It movie in 2017 and It Chapter 2 this year, because just the visual effects that have become so much better in that time span. It's like, okay, you know, I am totally more of a fan of this design for Pennywise than the Tim Curry design, just because, you know, he looks a little less intimidating, I would say, when you just first see him pop up on the screen. He kind of just looks like this weird clown that you probably shouldn't trust, but at the same time, just looks like he might be a guy who isn't completely put together, you know, drinking on
Yeah.
the job or something. But this version of it, it's just like from the start, you're like, you know what? No, thank you. And I just really like how this story has had such an impact on pop culture in general. You know, we mentioned Stranger Things, which very clearly pulls from Stephen King influences, and, you know, Alien and things like that, that just totally blew up at the time. And, you know, we talked about quite a bit of the story, but we obviously didn't dive into every single little detail here. I think we'd be here all day if we did that. But, you know, this story just has so much to it that if you haven't read it yet, I would highly recommend taking the time to do it. It'll take you a while. You know,
Oh
like
yeah.
I said, it took me 2 weeks to read this, and I read quite a bit. You know, I read a lot more than a lot of other people that I know. So, you know, definitely take your time with it and just see if it's something that really resonates with you. And I think there's something that will resonate for everyone in this. And, you know, we didn't even talk about some of the events that were extremely homophobic or anything like that. So I just quickly want to touch on that because in the present day storyline, when Pennywise returns, you have this group of guys who are very clearly homophobic, and they are giving this guy a hard time because he's holding hands with another man. And that is when you really see just how much the town hasn't exactly changed, in the era of the 50s to the 80s. It's like, that's something that was still very prevalent at the time. And it was another one of those moments where it was hard to read just because today it's like, oh, that really does not go over well.
Oh yeah, I like that. You know, one, this is going to be in the movie. They're going to touch on it in the movie.
Right.
But even with, like, it knows how to basically appeal to the worst of us, because with, the racism that happens in the 1920s, and then now, like, the homophobic attack that happened in the 1980s, it shows that as old as it is, and how, Derry is kind of going back from the 50s to the 80s, it's still in kind of the small town mindset where, gay people are bad. And then, like, even though Mike stays there, he's had trauma because of all the, the racial attack of Henry Bauer and his friends. So I liked that they showed that, and that you could still kind of move through time, but they could still be kind of small minded, like it.
Yeah. And it's basically a parallel to Henry Bowers and his group of friends. And the character is Adrian Mellon, and he basically dies this brutal death because these guys decide to throw him off a bridge. And, you know, when Mike realizes what happens, he can tell that, oh, this wasn't just the doing of these men. There's something more here. And that's when everything starts to click and he decides to make the calls. So, that's a big crux of bringing all of the characters back together. So, that was one final thing I did want to mention because it is important to have that happen in a sense, but in a way, the way that it happens is just something that makes you feel again like a little,
Uneasy.
well, a lot uncomfortable reading it, and you just kind of feel icky about the whole situation. And Stephen King really is able to write just these horrific things that make you so uncomfortable while you're reading his books. It's really amazing that he's able to do that, even if it's something that you wish didn't have to be written necessarily.
Yeah, well, I feel like, it is pretty much the personification of evil. So, like, while this was horrific, of course, it showed that there's like a real face. And the fact that, like, it may have, in these small towns, like this, like you said, like we touched upon, like being in a bigger city where a lot of people are more accepting and whatnot. In the small towns, even going into the 80s, this is still happening, and then it is just exploiting that within us. So not only can it affect us, or affect them physically, it's just magnifying the ugliness that we kind of already have. So, like, I like that the lesson that Stephen King showed.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, is there anything else you want to touch on before we wrap this up?
I know that part two comes out in September. If you can't, just read the book, like, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
see the miniseries, watch, it part one, and then watch it part two again when it comes out. But read the book, and you'll see how the three are different. They're different because, like you said, with the miniseries, like I saw the miniseries when I was a little bit younger, and I mean there are some kind of, like, I guess, scary images in it, and Tim Curry is good in his incarnation, but it was a little bit more, I guess, a little bit more campy because it was a made for TV movie,
Yeah.
so they can only do so much. But I feel that the movie version is more towards what Stephen King was trying to get at, because you have more liberties, like you said, technology is caught up, whatnot. It's more towards, the grittiness, uh, the creepiness and like there's a kid in the movie. There's a kid who gets slashed. You know what I mean? Like there's another kid who breaks their arm. Like that's not going to happen. It wasn't going to happen in the miniseries. So
Right.
it's a little bit more closer to the book. But yeah, definitely read the book. Like it's a good read. It took me about 2 weeks to read again too. So it's definitely going to take you some time, but it's definitely worth diving into.
One quick note of follow up, since you mentioned that we had just discussed the Bachman books, there is an adaptation coming of The Long Walk. Hopefully, it is something that they will see through, because we had touched on what a good adaptation of that could look like. So I just wanted to bring that up. I know it's probably old news by the time you're all hearing this, but MJ, since you were the one on that episode, I felt the need to just follow up with that quickly here. And thank you so much for coming on to discuss it. Like I said, we could have gone much longer if we dived into, like every little section
Yeah, we could
of
have.
what happened, but we won't subject the listeners to that.
Yeah, no problem. This was a fun read. Well, some parts weren't, but like this was a good read overall.
Yeah, definitely. You can follow the podcast at Chat Cemetery on Twitter and Instagram. If you would like to give us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts, that would be awesome. And as always, thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.